comment.
Mr. Patterson, yes.
Real quick, my middle son.
Just for the record, we've been through the plumber and your middle son. Just to short circuit a future conversation. What's your other son do?
Are you familiar with the Central Valley Interconnect and the fact that it was one of our issues that we tried to incorporate into the water bond? It was, in fact, not included. We had some promises with respect to some appropriations and all. Unfortunately, I think the appropriations, if they come about, are probably half or even more on the short side of being able to actually do it. I just wanted to just make sure that you and others that are looking at this and with respect to the bond and all, that interconnect between the federal and the state projects probably one of the most significant and important ways in the short term to create flexibility and an ability to at least manage some of the more catastrophic kinds of things. For the first time, the senior water holders on the San Joaquin made claim to it, which has really dried up the east side. We've seen hundreds and hundreds of citrus acres plowed under as a result. That interconnect would have created the opportunity to manage between those two, we think, so that we might very well have missed that terrible challenge of one winner and a loser. Can you help me understand where that appropriation might be coming from? I understood the governor had committed to that. And could that interconnect in some way or another qualify for some of the bond resources?
I met with water people from the Friant area earlier this week and am aware of the issue. And the one thing is there does have to be some local piece of this, and there has to be some local initiative that is part of it. And I think that there are some connections right now in a way that if people wish to engage early in the time of shortages on water purchases that are between in the water market arena, everybody can work to try to get the water to the right place. But I'll have to follow up with you on that because I'm not aware of a promise that was made in the status of that. And I'll just see. I will look into that and pledge to do it to you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Secretary Laird, for your presentation here this morning, and thank you for leading on what is a difficult conversation around, and a complicated conversation around adaptation and sea level rise.
Thank you.
Important.
Appreciate it.
Secretary Ross, welcome.
Thank you.
It's good to see you again.
Good morning. So I'll try to be as brief as possible since we are a small department, but we are mighty and lean and very efficient. And I want to start my comments with just a big picture overview of the department, but I don't want to go there without first saying thank you. My grandmother taught me well that when good things happen, it's important to say thank you, and you can never say it too much. And I have two very specific examples of the work of this committee, the staff of the Department of Finance who worked with us last year, somewhat at the last minute, to provide some additional funding for two very important programs. And they had real-life results, and I think it's important to share it with you. The Department of Food and Agriculture is charged with protecting the state from invasive species and plant and animal diseases. And last year, we were going through the exercise of how we could reconfigure ours and perhaps closing some of our border stations. Our border protection stations do inspections of incoming cargo at our domestic ports of entry, and we were prepared to close some facilities so that we could beef up staffing at other facilities. And the legislature, working with finance and us, decided that we could reoperate some of those facilities and make sure that high-risk pathways had full staffing at 24 hours a day. And as a result of that and having really great staff, we actually intercepted self-mover van that had a tree in it that was a citrus tree, which we confiscated because those are not allowed. That tree was carrying Wang Long Bing, the disease that we're trying to protect our citrus industry from. So it was a very real-life example that gives me the chance to say thank you for working with us on reconfiguring the hours for our border protection stations. The other example that was occurring right during May Revise is that we had an incidence for the first time in several years of high pathogenic avian influenza. Our resources were very, very strained at that time. Supplemental funding was provided to help us with emergency staffing and some of the training needs that we had. We highlighted at that time the importance of our animal lab system and the diagnostics that are provided through that lab system. And we were able to get enough funding to get through the year, and that helped us immediately isolate that very contagious disease that could have wiped out a huge poultry population, and we were able to work on that. We've now been able to staff up with some of the training needs. But what we're asking for going forward this year is an investment for the future of that lab system to ensure that we can operate at the level that's necessary for the important livestock sector that we have in the state. So our budget going forward does include $4.3 million. That's an increase to cover a deficiency in the lab budget that's actually been there for about 10 years when we haven't been able to keep up with those operating costs. So there's $3 million to make them whole for the next fiscal year, and $1.3 million for the new animal lab that's being constructed in Tulare. That lab is in a very strategic location for our dairy sector. Our dairy sector is uniquely positioned to take strategic advantage of being on the West Coast for the export demand that continues to build. And so we're investing for the future of an industry that's contributing huge economic revenue to the state of California. We also have in our budget an increase for funding for our fairs network. We've gone through a tumultuous time of working at the local level with our fairs network to make sure that we were doing everything possible to reconnect with our local communities. The fairs have done a great job of finding sponsorships, of creating 501c3 organization, Friends of the Fairs, but we continue to have anywhere from 12 to 15 fairs on an annual basis that are in jeopardy of not being able to cover their operating expenses. So we've worked very closely with the Governor's Office, Department of Finance, and are asking for your support. That's a $10 million. That would be $7 million for deferred maintenance. Like all good entities, when you have structures that you own, you have to continually invest to make sure that you're protecting the public health and safety. And then there's $3 million, 2.6 that would actually be for an annual allocation to help small and mid-sized fairs with some of the operating expenses they simply can't raise because of the locations where they are, as well as adding to our full staff of 2 people, 2 more positions to really work on governance and training to help boards of directors and CEOs be in compliance with the requirements that we have for them. I know that you'll have other hearings on our budget. We have other BCPs that are very small. Most of those are around implementing legislation that was passed last year. We also have included in our budget request $200,000 for what we had hoped we wouldn't need, which is the socioeconomic impact of drought. The one that we funded last year was actually very important in helping the legislature and the Department of Finance target spending of emergency relief dollars for our farm worker community and really making sure that we were getting dollars to the communities most impacted. And I think that the work that we funded through the University of California was very informative to what we did last year. I want to shift to the department's role in climate change. We have a secondary and tertiary role as far as structure across government, but we know that no sector is more impacted by climate change than agriculture, especially the kind of agriculture that we have in this state. The ability to grow over 200 different kinds of crops, to be able to have a number of really healthy, nutritional crops that we can grow literally somewhere in the state on a year-round basis could be hugely impacted by climate change. So I wanted to touch on some of the programs that were funded for us last year and this year that deal with mitigation, but also acknowledge the extreme importance of adaptation for agriculture. First of all, under the drought legislation that was passed on an emergency basis last year, $10 million from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund was included for the statewide water efficiency and energy program. That has been a very popular program. We stood it up, unfortunately, right in the middle of harvest time, so we actually did 2 rounds of funding. We had $10 million that actually we had over 453 project requests, totaling $33.5 million, which shows the popularity of working with farmers to cost share their investment in improving their adapted water use. And that program has been put in place with expert input from the University of California and the California State University system. We did a number of stakeholder public meetings to get additional input in putting that program together. And we have allocated over $9.6 million for individual projects up and down the state. One of the ways we've been able to use the Cal EnviroScreen as an internal check to make sure that we're getting placement of a number of those projects in disadvantaged communities, and we are mapping it out so that we can demonstrate to you and to the public where those dollars are going on a very precise basis up and down the state to really assist communities in need. That's a program that was funded on a one-time basis under the drought emergency legislation. Obviously, we're very hopeful because of the subscription to that with additional funding, we might be able to continue that program going forward. We also, with the greenhouse gas reduction funding that was made available last year, received, I have to check my numbers, $15 million. $12 million of that was for dairy digester. We want to make sure that as a state that has almost 2 million dairy cows, more than any other state, that we can try to catch up with other states on deploying the technology of dairy digesters, which is actually taking, only the Secretary of Agriculture gets to talk about cow poop. Okay, moving on from that, but taking this byproduct of our livestock sector and actually deploying it in a way to create alternative fuels and electricity. When we started in 2011, the first thing we did was created a state and federal dairy digester work group to really take a look at what the barriers were for having more of this technology deployed on our dairy farms. And we were able to identify all the permit issues with help from the California Environmental Protection Agency. We now have a consolidated permit review process, which we think is going to help us do placement of this. I'm really pleased to say that we have stood up the program for grants to help stand up more dairy digesters on farms. That comment period and the application period closed on Monday. We received 12 applications that will be reviewed by a technical committee. The total request in dollars was over $27 million. And I think that as the first ever program like this in the state of California, it's an important signal to the industry that we're very serious about this technology and understand the multiple benefits that can come by deploying more dairy digesters up and down the state of California. It will also be an important resource for our dairy farmers as an alternative income stream as well. So we're very excited of reporting what the results are of that particular program next year. Included in that allocation was $3 million for the alternative renewable fuels program. This is actually a small program at our Division of Weights and Measurement Standards. It's very important that to deploy renewable biofuels or renewable energy, we have to first create the standards to make sure it's safe and it's reliable and it's consistently available on a commercial basis. So that funding's being used by our division to create the standards, to do the testing, and to make sure that we can deploy the technology up and down the state of California so that we have an infrastructure of delivering, whether it's electricity or hydrogen or other types of alternative fuels, that we've put the infrastructure in place to make that readily available to consumers. We are also working on what was mentioned before on a sustainable soils, on the Healthy Soils Initiative. That is something that the governor directed us in the budget to work across agency to develop a program. We're in the process of doing that and hope to have something out for public comment within the next few weeks. It's been very interesting to see all the programs across government that actually touch on this initiative and the huge opportunities we have to create incentives for management practices with just slight adjustment can really be a part of storing carbon nitrogen and building soil organic matter on a way that will make us resilient to climate, resilient to drought, improve the health of our soils, and therefore hopefully reduce inputs over a period of time. And with that, I'm happy to take any of your questions that you may have.
Thank you, Secretary Ross, and I want to particularly thank you for talking about your department's role in overseeing programs that are of importance to disadvantaged communities. I think it goes without saying that when we think about the agriculture industry in California, it is side by side with many of our most disadvantaged communities, and so thinking about that issue is very important for us. And also, yes, you may be the only secretary who gets to talk about cow poop, but we also understand the outsized impact of methane gas
Exactly right.
when it comes to issues of greenhouse gas emissions. And so I very much appreciate that. Are there any questions? And
If I could just touch, I do think...
since you're not getting a question,
Yeah,
figure
I'll
you'll
just keep on talking.
riff a little bit here.
We actually have a
Go right ahead.
have a meeting going on right now with a number of national scientists from the United States Department of Agriculture. One of the things that we learned in putting together the water efficiency program is that calculating greenhouse gases is not something that most farmers are equipped to do, nor have they had to actually quantify before. So making decision tools readily available and user-friendly calculators is something that we've learned. We've been able to do some pretty modest attempts in that. But we're working with the United States Department of Agriculture to embed in all of the practices that they fund through some of their incentive programs the calculation of how those practices will reduce greenhouse gas emissions and improve their climate resiliency. We think that's a hugely important tool to assist our farmers as we go down this pathway. And a lot of the work that we've done through the Climate Action Team and the Strategic Growth Council has really forced that kind of collaboration so that we can work across cabinet and really leverage what every one of the departments is doing to be of assistance to our farming community. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Secretary Kelly in Department of Transportation. Welcome.
Good morning,
See you.
Mr. Chairman, members. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today and provide a brief overview of the budgets for the Transportation Agency and its departments. I thought I'd take a few minutes to give you a broad overview of that budget with the numbers, tell you a little bit about some of the things we're working on that are directly tied to climate change per your opening question of us, and then highlight just a couple of important things that our departments are working on as we move forward in 2015 and beyond. First, with respect to the budget summary, the entirety of our agency office and departments includes 7 different departments plus the agency office. We have a total budget of $15.8 billion, and we, of course, include the 3 big departments in Caltrans, CHP, and the DMV. Our total state workforce in our departments are just under 40,000 state employees. So we've got a lot going on all the time, and those big 3 departments, of course, are very much the face of state government for Californians. In moving to answering some of your initial questions on the key actions that we are working on relative to climate change, I would point to a few. The first is our focus to date with the investments of transportation funds has been on clean transportation options and partnering with our communities to implement SB 375 planning documents, which of course are all about reducing VMT and more efficient use of land. We are also getting ready to put the cap and trade dollars that were identified in SB 862, the trailer bill last year, putting those dollars to work this year. The agency and the Department of Transportation has adopted
the guidelines to move those programs forward. At agency for the transit grant program, we have already put out a call for projects. We expect applications for projects to be into the agency by April 10th, and we are moving toward awarding projects in June. We also are continuing with the development, as part of the cap and trade investment as well, the development of high-speed rail as a clean transportation alternative in the state of California. You will see in Caltrans's budget a request for continuing our work to clean the vehicle fleet within the department. And we are working with Caltrans on they've already established a new mission, vision, and goals, which gets the department from focusing on simply safety and mobility issues in the state of California's transportation system to also sustainability and a greater effort toward making sure we have an eye on our emissions out of the transportation system. Finally, we are working on some recommendations that came out of a work group we put together last year. And following legislation passed last year, we are moving on exploring the option of alternative sources of revenue for transportation, including the implementation or at least the exploration of something called the road user charge, and also a trailer bill to expand the use of pricing or tolling in the state's transportation system. So those are a few things that we are moving forward on. Outside of the strict actions relative to climate change, I just want to mention, of course, big activity at the Department of Motor Vehicles includes the continued implementation of AB 60. Some quick numbers on that so you all just have a feeling for what we're doing there. Since January 2nd, which was the effective or the first operative date of that legislation, there's been 586,000 visits to the DMV offices spread throughout the state, representing 345,000 individuals seeking an AB 60 license. We have issued 110,000 driver's licenses since January 2nd. In preparing for this, the department hired 900 people. We opened 4 driver's license processing centers around the state. We extended Saturday office hours at 60 locations around the state. As I mentioned, opened 4 of the driver's license processing centers in San Jose, Stanton, Granada Hills, and Lompoc. We continue to participate in numerous outreach events statewide with members' offices, consulate offices, and community groups to educate potential customers about the process, required documents, and the reminder to study for the knowledge test. When we first started the program, certainly there was an impact on some of the wait times at our offices, but those are improving greatly. When we first started, those who were coming to the DMV with an appointment saw wait times up to 32 minutes in a field office, and by last week that was down to 13 minutes. Our knowledge test pass-fail rate, which many members have been interested in as well, has a pass-fail rate statewide of 47% pass and 53% fail on the first time of taking the exam, which is quite consistent with where we've been historically. So there's not a huge shift. We continue to monitor and make adjustments to the field offices with this program, and look forward to continuing to provide service that Californians expect out of the Department of Motor Vehicle. I think with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll sort of stop there and open up to any questions you have, or cover any ground you want me to cover that I did not.
The a statement that you made about the 43% pass-fail rate being consistent with where we are in the past. Do we ever compare ourselves to other states and take a look at what best practices are? Just generally, not specifically to AB 60.
Yeah, I can. The best I can do is give you a partial answer on that, which is for English tests that are administered in California, the pass rate's 51, the fail rate is 49. Our overall numbers for all languages considered, pass 47, fail 53. And the only thing I could say comparative to other states, there were 10 other states that had started offering the AB60-like driver's licenses before California started, and some of those saw very high failure rates in the beginning of the offering of those licenses, particularly from the audience that was seeking that particular license. We spent a great deal of time in our workup over the past year using message points, community outreach, non-English speaking media outlets to encourage people to study for the exam. And it's in the message in the driver handbook and other places on the website. We think that's had some impact. I know that in Nevada, for example, when they first started offering the license, the failure rate of that universe was 80%. And so that's the best I have on that.
Okay, I think that'll be an interesting topic of conversation when the DMV comes before us. I think the overall question for me is not just in initial testing, but through driver schools that people go to as a result of ticketing and so forth. Are we being rigorous enough, and are we implementing best practices? It seems to me it's something we haven't looked at in a long time in the state. When do you expect to award the first round of funding for transit and intercity rail capital programs?
We have just put out the call for projects on those, Mr. Chairman, and the project applications will be due to us by April 10th, and we look to award by June 30th.
I presume that you've done some level of review of the Speaker's $2 billion proposal to increase funding for highway and road maintenance. I don't know if you have any comments on that program that you'd like to offer, but also if the state were to raise something on the level of $2 billion, how would you propose allocating it between state highways and local road maintenance needs?
I have had some review of it, although candidly, Mr. Chairman, I think more details will be forthcoming on that proposal. But
it's admittedly very sketchy right now.
I do think it's a helpful part of the dialogue. I think that there are several options. We've been in 2 separate legislative committee hearings this week talking about various funding options for transportation. I think anything that's added to that, particularly coming from a leader's office, is valuable for that conversation, and we look forward to engaging further on that option. In terms of the highest priority for use of funds, it is our view that we have generally underinvested in the maintenance and preservation of the state highway system. We are putting some other funds, cap and trade, other funds, in active transportation funding in other programs for transit and bike and pedestrian facilities, which we think are important and good things to do and really part and parcel of implementing SB 375 plans. But I would say that we think there's been an ongoing sort of underinvestment in the preservation of the state highway system. I'm reminded that with the massive bond bill that we recently did in 2006, $20 billion bond for transportation, only $500 million of that was made available for state highway preservation. We have a rather large deferred maintenance problem in that area. So our first priority would be to try to address that deferred maintenance.
I understand that. I would encourage you to take an inventory around the state of local communities.
Oh, yeah.
Some of which, I could point to communities in my own district where some communities have been able to keep up very well with maintaining roads, and in other communities there is an inordinate amount of deferred maintenance that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, I in no way mean to imply that there's not a demand elsewhere. I'm simply reflecting sort of the state asset situation, but yes, clearly there's demand everywhere.
Understood. Mr. Williams.
I just was pleased, number one, that you were looking at it from the all of the above perspective, that transit also would deserve a portion of that. I also just think it underscores how important it is that there is so much deferred maintenance. Civilizations are built infrastructure, and I think we don't want to be the Latter-day Roman Empire looking at a bunch of crumbling aqueducts and roads and going, God, it was really nice when they knew how to repair those things. And I think that means we have to make investments.
Agree.
If there are no other questions, well, thank you very much for
Okay.
your testimony.
Thank you,
here
Mr.
today.
Chairman and members.
Appreciate seeing you.